All right, we look live. I'll give it a couple of seconds. Just let people join in. All right, looks like people are coming in as we speak. Gonna give it a little bit more time. All right, so welcome everybody. Welcome to our stream. My name is Matthew, and I am a bookseller as well as an events personnel at here at Majors in Quinn. And I just want to go ahead and thank everyone for joining us this evening. Whether you're viewing this live or if you're viewing a recording of it archived later down the line, we really can't do what we do without your support here in our community. So even just by viewing our events and participating in small ways, we sincerely appreciate you being part of our community. Just a brief rundown as to what we're going to be doing this evening. We will be hearing a reading from tonight's featured book, and following that, we will be hearing conversation between our two authors and a brief Q&A portion. So if anything should pop up in your head and you want to know more about the book or the process or whatever, go ahead and ask those questions in the comments section, and we will hopefully be able to get to them. In addition to that, we want to know where you're tuning in from. So go ahead and post a little bit about like what city you're coming in from, what state, just to let us know where we're reaching to. And as well, I will be posting a link to tonight's featured book throughout the evening. So if you want more information on that and you want to go ahead and place an order for that, that will be available in the comments section. So without further ado, I will hand this over to our authors for some introductions.
Thank you so much for coming out, everyone, tonight. And it's fantastic to be with Magers and Quinn, one of my very favorite bookstores in the country. I'm going to be reading tonight from my new memoir, Wonder Travels, that just came out a week ago. And this is a memoir that is really about healing. It's about healing after the end of a 15-year marriage, 13 years married, a couple years together separately. And at the moment of discovering an affair that my wife had had after having a 6-month trip around the world. In 2008, she traveled around the world, and towards the end of her trip, she had a relationship with a man she met on the beach in Morocco named Mohammed. Then she came back to New York City, where we were living at the time. It was clear that things weren't good, but I didn't understand why. And a couple months later, she said she was going to go back to Spain, where she was from. She's a Spanish citizen. And she said she was going to see her sister have her child born. And this seemed only unusual because she had 16 other nieces and nephews who had been born without her ever going back to see them. Soon after she got back to Spain, a couple days after getting there, she told me that she was going to go to the island of Ibiza. And this seemed particularly strange because those of you who have ever been to Ibiza know that it's an island in the middle of the Mediterranean where people really go to party hard. And it seemed completely different from going to see her sister. In fact, she didn't go to Ibiza. She went back to Morocco to be with Mohammed. And it was during those 3 weeks, towards the end of her time there, after 12 days of all communication being shut off, that I was told by a good friend that I had to start being concerned for myself because she was having an affair. And I'm going to read a passage from just after discovering that that was the case. Her few prized possessions from her childhood are in that box. There are boxes of letters in there from the little correspondence she's been able to keep. When she came to the US, she wrote letters regularly to her family back in Spain, but they rarely replied. And there's some love letters in there, letters which tell her that I have always been suspicious of romantics who write their names on the beach, who send each other flowers, but that this is how I feel about her, that I love her completely and unconditionally. There's another letter from 4 years before. While I tell her I know there are things I would like to keep improving to continue to be a better husband, but that I feel this has been the best year of our lives together, that she is realizing her dreams of being in the magazine world, and that I love her. There are boxes of photos from our trips on the shores of Maine and New Brunswick and Grand Manan, where we regularly go camping, and from the bottom of the Grand Canyon in the middle of winter, from China, Burma, Cambodia, Thailand, and Spain, and photos of us celebrating an after-marriage party in Spain 2 years after we eloped, in which my two grandmothers and uncles and aunt and parents flew to Spain for the small get-together of 40, just her immediate family and a few of her friends. What am I supposed to do with these photos? I can't look through them all, it's too unbearable, and I put them back. She will return soon if she comes home and I don't feel safe. I gather my financial records together and leave a box with my neighbors. I take my grandfather's old, somewhat broken Rolex and a copy of all the computer files on our desktop. And I take all the belongings in our safety deposit box, which are mine, and I get a new safety deposit box. It's crazy, I know. What could she possibly do to me? But it doesn't feel crazy. It feels prudent, smart. I've been told by two friends to protect myself. I've been lied to, and I feel I know nothing about what she values anymore. An affair, the way she is disrespecting us, shatters the myth we share the same values. An affair is something I have told myself in the past I would never do. When she was on her long 6-month trip, I saw a beautiful woman on the subway platform, and it was the middle of winter, and my wife had been gone on her trip for 4 months at the time, and I was lonely, and I thought about that woman on the platform, imagining a relationship with her. But I knew I would never act on that impulse out of respect for us. And when a couple weeks later I saw her again and felt the same impulse, I still didn't act on it, even though two strangers rarely meet again in the subway of New York. What do we share anymore after she has lied and gone back to Morocco? Once, meeting him on her trip, I can understand. A moment of impulse, of human frailty, even if she was with him for 5 nights. But after she has created a whole complicated lie, claiming she's in Ibiza when she has really gone back to see him, this is not a moment. This is premeditated. This is willful. And if she is under his sway, enamored by him, who knows where things are headed? The night before she's supposed to come back, I meet with her friend downstairs, who she's installed in the building, who has left her husband after 28 years. I tell her I believe Luciana has had an affair in Morocco when she was on her long trip. I say nothing about Ibiza and the present. I tell her this, and I see her begin to tear up. I tell her this because I suspect she's in contact with my wife in Morocco, and at this point I don't mind if word leaks back to her. I know what's up, because I just want her to come home so we can talk. I tell her I don't know how I'll respond when my wife comes home, but that I hope to respond calmly. I tell her I've been thinking a lot about Gandhi, about how the best way to respond to someone is with nonviolence, for only they can judge themselves if they are to absorb what they have done. She tells me she's seen a pop psychology show on TV in which the host suggests in a time of confrontation one can choose to do nothing. Not doing anything is a choice. She's clearly suggesting I should not act violently when she comes home. Another friend who I've met for coffee, the screenplay writer with the apartment where we had the coming home party for Luciana after her trip, asked me if I feel like hitting her when she comes home or acting violently. I tell him no. I tell him I don't believe in that kind of violence. I tell him we've never screamed at each other or fought physically before. The day before she comes home, I call her mother in Spain to ask if she's returned from Ibiza to Madrid. Her mother says she thinks she has and that she's staying with one of her siblings. I try to contain my emotions over the phone, and I tell her I have reason to suspect her daughter has been in a relationship with another man. Her mother says she doesn't believe this. I tell her I have strong reasons to suspect she's been in Morocco instead of Ibiza. Her mother is confused. I tell her if she doesn't believe me, she should talk to one of her other daughters who has used her frequent flyer miles to purchase the ticket to Morocco for Luciana instead of to Ibiza. I tell her mother I'm only mentioning this because I want her to pass on to her daughter the reassurance that she should just come home, that everything will be all right, and that she shouldn't be afraid of coming home. Are you sure you want me to tell her that? She says. No, I say, only tell her that if she doesn't get on the plane. I just want her to come home so we can lay everything out openly on the table. I don't want any violence. And if she's afraid to come home, I want her to know everything will be okay. For a second, the thought crosses my mind that perhaps she'll tell her family she's flying back to America and then catch another plane to Morocco. Except for one of her sisters, she's lied to her whole family about going to Ibiza. These fears are unfounded. After 12 days of complete silence, Luciana calls from the airport in Madrid to say she's flying back home. We speak for all 5 seconds. When she has the will, she can contact me at any moment. In little more than 8 hours, her plane will touch down. I've protected myself, and now I try to distract myself. The medicine cabinet has arrived, and in an effort to prove I've made good progress on the renovation of the apartment, I spend most of the afternoon drilling holes through tiles and installing the cabinet single-handedly. I also install it because I don't want a big mirrored piece of glass lying on the floor at such a delicate and potentially violent time when she returns. I want the apartment to be clean. I want it to be nice and calm. I want to look good to impress her. It's a hot, humid day in New York, July 22nd, and once the medicine cabinet is up, I see I'm sweating hard from the work, and in anticipation of her arrival, a zit has come out. By now, she's probably arrived at the airport. I don't know how she'll be coming from JFK, whether she'll take the train as usual or take a cab, so I have no way of knowing exactly when she'll get home. I know her plane has arrived because I've looked up the landing online. I don't want to miss her when she comes in the door, but I need to do something about this zit. So I run up the street to a pharmacy to buy some Neutrogena pore cleanser. The turquoise cleanser looks beautiful in the new cabinet, which we will not share together, with mirrors reflecting the liquid from all sides. I clean my face. I put on an iron button-down shirt, which I know she'll like, with my best pair of fashionable jeans. I take a perfumed candle, which she's bought and that I know she likes, and I light it and put it on the coffee table. The smell of sweet incense burns slowly into the night air as the sun goes down. I leave off the lights in the small dining room so the mood is calm and not too bright. I leave on only a lamp and the candle in the living room, by the couch where I wait for her, seated with my legs up on the table. I've turned up the stereo loud, and I play a CD by Goldfrapp over and over. The driving beat of electronic sound, the high yet calm voice, the underlying powerful bass, the melancholy twinge to the entire album sedates, numbs, mirrors my mood and comforts me. I'm here, but I am in space. I'm present and waiting in this apartment, but I am thinking over the trajectory of our past. I'm thinking about us in Spain and trips far away. And then I notice the bumpy metal texture of the coffee tabletop and the flicker of the flame in the glass candle holder. I fixate on these textures, these smells of incense, these surfaces, the nothingness of a moment, the feeling of emptiness of her expected arrival. What more is there to say except to play the funeral dirge, the end of our marriage? She comes in later than I expect. Her plane has arrived more than 2 hours ago, and even with immigration, she should have already been here. The music is loud. I don't move from my position. I stare forward blankly, lost in the music and in my thoughts, and in the texture of the furniture. I hear the metal front door faintly as it falls shut. I hear her put her bag down. I hear her move around. She doesn't say hello. The music is loud and she doesn't turn it down. She traipses around the corner, from the dining room into the living room, and she catches a glimpse of me, and she turns around and goes to the bathroom. She must have jet lag. She goes to the refrigerator and pulls out a pitcher of cold water and has a drink. She's sizing up the situation, developing her strategy, figuring out her first move. I've said nothing so far, nothing negative, nothing welcoming, Nothing at all. When I'm angriest, I'm silent, she knows. I'm opaque, waiting, watching her without any movement, my eyes cast forward, looking into the candle. She says hello and decides to try to act normally, as if she's just come home from a normal quick trip abroad. I don't respond. She sits down on the couch at the far end from me. She leans her body away from me. She's tan from being on the beach in Morocco. She wears a white cotton shirt, similar to the one she wore when she first seduced me years before. What has she worn for him? She leans back and begins to say something trivial and normal, and I interrupt and say, I want you to tell me the truth. I just want you to tell me the truth. She pulls her jaw up sharply, shutting her mouth, as if thinking of protesting, and then thinks better of it and realizes she's caught. So you already know, she says. Thank you.
Josh, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Sugi Ganeshananthan. It's a huge pleasure to be here with Josh, one of my favorite writers, via one of my favorite local independent bookstores. I am here in Minneapolis, and so always thrilled to work with Majors and Quinn, and especially delighted to discuss this amazing book, Wonder Travels, which I've so enjoyed reading. Josh, congratulations. I can't wait to talk about this. So I want to just start by addressing, it's a book that has wonder in the title, and it's also about this experience that is incredibly painful. You refer to it as a book about healing. And I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about deciding to write about what for many people would be an intensely private experience.
Yeah, that's such a good point you're bringing up, Sugi. I mean, this idea of wonder and the pain and how does it all come about? I think one of the things I felt, of course, when I first experienced the shock of the discovering the affair, and again, I want to say at the very outset, anytime a marriage breaks down, it's two people involved in the breakdown. This is not a memoir of blame, and it's really not that kind of book. But it's something that when I faced the kind of initial shock of the affair, the last thing I was thinking, of course, was I want to sit down and start writing something about this. And so I didn't for the better part of a year. But after about a year, and long before all the events of this memoir, which takes place over a couple year period from 2008 into kind of the end of 2010, I started writing the book. And one of the reasons I started writing it was that I wanted to precisely capture the kind of messiness of the feelings that I was having. I had gone through, by the time I started writing, I was in El Paso. I had kind of fled New York City. I'd been in New York City for about 9 months after kind of the breakdown of the marriage. And during that time, I was really flailing in New York City. I was at first kind of very cooped up alone in my own apartment. Winter was coming on. And then I kind of began this almost frantic attempt to connect with people, to go out, and met just a variety of characters in New York City, and had all these kind of not even relationships, but just kind of efforts to connect with people. And often finding that while I could connect with them to some extent on an emotional level as kind of incipient friends, that I was still very much a mess, felt this incapacity to even really begin to connect in any kind of romantic way. And so beginning the book was wanting to capture this kind of messiness that I had gone through, but also to use this book as a kind of vehicle to search for some kind of happiness, and not in some kind of Pollyannish, simplistic way. It sounds so trite if you say, well, I want to go off and try and find happiness. But I felt that I kind of wanted to use this as a goal, as I had already been doing to some extent. And then the wonder, which we'll come around to and talking some more, was just all the incredible experiences that I did have over those couple of years. Everything from even the moments that were difficult, like going into the loneliness that I was feeling after I moved to El Paso, and where I really kind of felt a nadir. But then the wonder of going into places like the Apache Kid Wilderness, where you have some of the most amazing mountains in the American West. And then on to Mexico City, where I fell in love with a painter and began a profound relationship with her, and kind of the wondrous experiences in Oaxaca and Rome and Morocco. So we could talk about those some more, but that's how the book got started.
That's all really fascinating, and I'm going to come back to so much of that. One of the things that so many people have commented on, and that I found extraordinarily striking in the book, is its extreme frankness and the way in which I feel, I mean, I haven't been through, I don't know, we've all been through experiences that are painful. And one of the things that happens is that ordinary life takes on this heightened feeling. And that's something that the book conveys so well. And that we can hear in the passage that you read, right? The stakes of everything, every small decision becomes freighted in a different way. And I wonder how you decided to take that approach, because you could have taken a different one. There's so many wonderful memoirs that are coming even at, similar material, but in a very different way. And this is ferocious in its directness, actually.
Yeah, I think one thing that I felt was that, and with any book that I've sat down to write, I always feel like I want to try and do something new, something that I haven't maybe found before. And in this case, part of it from the newness was, as I was beginning to mention before, with that idea of kind of starting to write about things before they even had all been lived. I had only lived some of the experiences that I was going to write about. And so I did want to capture that kind of messiness. But the other thing is, as you say, is this kind of frankness, and what some writers like Andre Dubus III have been calling brave. And it's a word that keeps coming up quite a bit. And I think if there is bravery in the book, it's in really not hiding from both my flaws and feelings at our weakest, like even feelings of, say, impotence, when you can't connect literally with someone else as because of the pain that you've suffered in losing a marriage and the breakdown of a marriage. But then also, as you're talking about, Sugi, with that idea of kind of the pacing and the detail, so that that heightened sense that you were just mentioning, so that we end up with a kind of scene where going through the divorce and meeting with the lawyer, and everything feels so heightened in that kind of moment. I had some leather bag that I just bought because I thought that Luciana would like that bag. And then she sees the bag and she kind of smirks at it, perhaps understandably. Maybe even it was possibly a ridiculous bag. But she looks at the bag and kind of makes some comment about, something about just how small, or something, how in her eyes it looked kind of ridiculous. And that's where you feel in those moments this kind of the heightened sense or the tension. And so everything can become, one of the things I talk about, for example, in the lawyer's office, is the way that lawyers shuffle these papers and moving them almost like a magician, so that the pain of what is being gone through at the moment isn't supposedly felt. But if you're observing these things and you see almost the artifice of it, and if you see the way that lawyers try and move through these things to take the pain away or hide it or disguise it, and you bring it to light and put it on the page, then the reader can feel that heightened emotion that is in all these experiences. And it's not just, it's a real heightened emotion. It's not hard. You're not having to make it up because you lived it.
So you were talking when you introduced the book, and you referred to it as a book about healing. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, and also what writing has to do with healing, how this might have been a different thing to process if you weren't writing about it.
Yeah. And I like to say that it's a book about healing because I want people to understand that more than anything, what I was seeking as a person, was to not end up bitter after this kind of the experience that I had gone through. And because really there was a disappearance of Luciana. She was someone who, in many ways, had a kind of what I call 52 ways of silence, of being silent. And so there was some ways in which sometimes that could be very beautiful, a kind of certain kinds of communication that could come through silence, just what was implied with each other. And at other times, sometimes that kind of silence could, over time, be destructive to the relationship because there was an incapacity to kind of express what she was unhappy with. And so that kind of silence was an indication sometimes of just hiding things off. And part of the healing was trying to deal with what felt like the disappearance then of the person I had been with for 15 years. Because suddenly, the person you've loved, suddenly the person, of course, there are many good years before. You don't last 15 years with someone unless there are many good years before things kind of devolving. And so what are you going to do with all that experience that you've had together, those 15 years? So the idea of healing was, I started to do all sorts of things to heal. At the most basic level, initially, I started to run. Right after I had found out, even before I knew that Luciana had had this affair, I knew when she'd come back after these 6 months of travel, something was very off, and I could see she wasn't happy. And I realized, okay, I need to start doing something, taking some kind of action, and I started to run. One thing that she indicated at the time she was dissatisfied with, she was someone who was quite physically active, doing yoga, things like that. And even though we would take these very long walks for miles in Manhattan, it was something that she expressed some dissatisfaction with about me. And so I started to run. And I lived at 109th and Broadway at the time in New York City, and I would go over to Riverside Park. And I began that first day in June, if I recall it exactly, in running not that far at all, maybe a mile, just running, 15 blocks or whatever south, along Riverside Park. And as time went on, I started running more and more miles, running through the winter when there were no leaves on the trees, when there was ice on my back, when I would be looking up as I did sit-ups and turning and touching the ice as I would do these push-ups. And that's kind of one indication of the healing and the efforts to heal. So that kind of physical, but then there are all sorts of other ways of trying to heal. Some was leaving New York City to get to a new place. A friend had encouraged me to go to El Paso. And so I went out there, had my 40th birthday, and El Paso felt like this nadir, this moment of, when you're 40 and your marriage has fallen apart and you're kind of on the lam running and potentially even running away from your problems, you're not feeling like you're healing yet, but you're trying to get somewhere. I worried that I was, and in El Paso, the friend I was with, who I was staying with, he liked to go out to these clubs, and at some of the places where we went, I remember one brunch we're together, and there were these heavy metal rockers who were there in El Paso who looked old and washed up and who had already peaked. And I wondered at that time, had I peaked already in my life? As this friend was saying, so many people had in El Paso. So the process of healing was trying to first just reach the bottom in a place like El Paso, accept that kind of loneliness, and then taking action, putting myself out there, beginning the process of traveling, going into that wilderness, say of the Apache Kid wilderness, putting myself out there, going down to Mexico City after I was invited there by someone, and allowing myself to begin a relationship with a painter who we began a relationship with. And all of those things began the process of healing, a slow healing, because real healing is not fast.
So travel is in the title of the book, right? The book begins when you are the person at home and Luciana is the one on the road. And then you go on the road yourself. And I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about the importance of travel to that healing and in this book, and maybe a little bit about some of you go to several places. And I wonder if you could talk about a couple of them.
Yeah, I think the thing about travel and the danger of it to some extent, for example, when Luciana began her 6-month trip around the world, I couldn't go with her because I was finishing up the edits in a novel that was about to come out. And in many ways, it seemed like she was going through somewhat of a midlife crisis at the time. So um, travel can be an escape to some extent. It can be a wonderful thing, but it can also be running away from things. And when I was in New York City, before I left to go to El Paso and then on to Mexico and all these other places, this much older man who was in his late 80s, who was a pianist, he came to me and he said, you can go wherever you want, but your problems will come with you because they're kind of within you. And so that's always the danger, right? We have this image, whether of traveling on the road with Kerouac, where you just kind of you're in the blues, you're the jazz clubs, where that kind of freedom and the open road gives you that liberation. But people forget, of course, that in Kerouac there's also this kind of darkness underneath. And so travel can mean all sorts of things. For me, what it began to be was slowly, and as I came to see it over time, is without intending for it necessarily to be a goal, it allowed me to root myself more and more in the present, to really root myself in the moment of experience itself, rather than the kind of looking back at the past and the pain from the past of what I had gone through, but to begin to take in these incredible experiences rooted in the present. So, for example, when I was in Mexico City, and when I was falling in love with this painter, Monica, we would go to the incredible museums in Mexico City, but we would also just, there's this incredible moment when we're on the rooftop of one of the Condesa de Efe hotel and the rain is coming down like mad. And we're sitting there with kind of this rain encroaching on us, but we're drinking and we're looking out over the whole city and the magnificence of the mountains spreading out around and feeling that tactile sensation of the rain. And then later, as I'm in places like Veracruz, in the jungle of Veracruz, where I'd gone to try and do some river rafting until the water was so high and swollen, this was a place where I could feel and see the birds. I had always loved birding, and it was a chance to connect with these kind of tropical birds, to see real pepperbark trees, the pepperbark, and to see the difficult labor of the people around me gathering oranges in the jungle of Veracruz, and to discover the kind of ruins that were there. The person I was with, a friend of Monica's, he had discovered these ruins as he was kayaking through this river in Veracruz. And so we were allowed to go into those ruins that were largely shut off and see and experience those ruins. And so those were the kinds of moments that began to root me more and more in the present. Or when I was in Oaxaca, when I was with Monica's nephew, or cousin, I should say, a tremendous person who really served as a kind of guide for myself. He's someone who he had separated and divorced from his wife previously, and he was so rooted in the mountains of Oaxaca. He was so rooted in trying to construct a house that would catch the rain of the place, that would create this ecological house that he had designed himself. He was rooted in, we were hiking together in the mountains there one morning, his dogs trotting alongside with us. And he would point out things to me, like snakes that we would see, or the kind of berries on the trees, or the peaks of the mountains, or just over the valley to the next town of San Agustin Etla, where there's this kind of beautiful Day of the Dead celebration that we had seen in the Dia de los Muertos. So these were all the kinds of things that started to heal me, and the traveling that started to feel so meaningful to me, and ultimately, yes, wondrous.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, you referred to Monica and the painter with whom you begin a relationship, and I wonder if you can talk about the role of new relationships in moving towards this point of healing.
Well, I think one of the things about new relationships is it's a fraught thing, right? At first, even the idea of contemplating it after you've been with someone for so long, 15 years, and after you've never thought, even if things at the end, of course, were not completely great together, or the marriage wouldn't have ended as it did. There's the sudden severing of a relationship or end of a relationship of many years leaves you feeling like um, that it seems almost impossible to connect again with someone. And so, in some ways, the last thing you want to do is to begin any kind of new relationship. And at the same time, what you're hoping for in a process of healing, especially, I think, I can only speak for myself, but when you've gone through someone having an affair, is this feeling of kind of a reduction of your own feeling of self-worth. And so you're seeking some kind of renewed sense of having value. And so you throw yourself out there into some kind of, you know, dating or proto relationships or something like that. And of course, you're not going to connect emotionally deeply at first. Like everyone, no matter how their relationship ends and how they have to begin again, you're starting that incredibly daunting thing of trying to find someone who really has deep meaning for you, as opposed to just some physical, less deep connection. And you're looking for something more, but you can't get to that more unless you throw yourself out there. And so I started to kind of put myself out there in New York City, but feeling all along as I would meet these very interesting people, like, you know, say a photo editor at the New York Times, or just a variety of people. Someone who worked for Blue Note, the jazz club, and who designed things, and I would go to the jazz clubs with her. These were people who I was all kind of beginning to connect with, and yet I couldn't, because I was in no way ready for anything like that. So I think part of the thing about a relationship, the importance of it in the healing process, is just allowing yourself to have time and to fall flat. And I fell so flat in places initially. I mean, when I was in El Paso, at one point, precisely, you talk about the kind of frankness and honesty of it. Leaving a club, um, my friend is gay there, go to many of these clubs, and ended up with one of his friends, woman who was actually straight, but completely different from me, with kind of, you know, earring in her tongue. We ended up full of chain smoker, drunk late at night, walking in El Paso as the kind of the as if the lights of the city were just kind of this gaudiness that seemed to mirror the feeling and experience that we were having, and ending up in this park where there were guys who were kind of drug dealing nearby, a cop car going around, and at some point she said to me, you know, "You're all mine," and I thought, what am I doing here in this moment with someone who I really had no connection with at that time? So the flailing also is there prior to eventually finding a much deeper connection, which I did with the painter Monica in Mexico City.
It's so interesting because the book's in present tense and you're describing writing some of it as you were living it. And so it's also like remarkably, it is very in the moment, even as what you are sometimes doing in the moment is contending with the past. Like you go and revisit people who you had known when you were married. So you're involved on also a kind of investigation of the past, trying essentially, I think, to reconcile the past with the present. And so the form of the book captures that really beautifully. And you've also spoken about your desire to make this right to for the book to help you to emerge from this experience not bitter. And one of the things I was most struck by, I mean, was just the first page because I opened it and I was like, oh, I'm about to read Josh's memoir. I'm sure this is going to be gorgeous, and I wasn't in your point of view. And I wonder if you would read a little bit of that beginning so that our audience can hear what I'm talking about.
Sure. I'm just going to read the first paragraph. And in Morocco, she fucked another man. He, generally a mystery, but I had seen photos of him before, dressed in a green and yellow Adidas tracksuit. Or was that his tall sidekick, the one making goofy karate kicks in the air in front of the Warzazat fort? Muhammad was his name. Modi, the love name she gave him. Modi Modi. In the photos, his eyes bloodshot like someone who fucks a lot at night. His eyes in control of her, mesmerizing her. Strong, brown, limpid eyes which connect with her as she photographs him indoors intimately, lying on long cushions in his house. The intimate light of late evening moves across the azure walls of his home. He has served her Moroccan sweet tea. He is laughing, playing with his sidekick in his home, his teeth bright white and fit, the alpha dog joshing with his friend, but his focus is on the photographer, who he will sleep with that night and the next 5 nights, even though his gaze, while hungry for her, seems to also already look through the lens of the camera with anticipation of the end. He is looking at her and through her, smiling for her like a poor prince who she met on the beach, charming her, reeling her in. They must have fucked well. And of course, it's crude there in the language. But the third person that you're talking about there, one thing I wanted to, and it's only, in a few pages later that then the I come in, because one of the things I'm trying to do in this memoir also, not in that passage that I just read, but in other passages, is to use the technique of memoir, of third person, to try and imagine Luciana's point of view, to try and imagine how she's feeling in a certain moment. Not in that paragraph that I just read, there's some distance there, but in others, for example, where I'm walking through Central Park with her, and we begin a walk in which at the beginning of the walk, I'm trying to see and understand the ways in which she feels unhappy in the relationship, how she feels over controlled, how she feels she doesn't have the freedom to do some of the things that she would like to do, and that she feels are stifled by me and by our relationship. And so that's one side of kind of the stepping in and out of the third person and then the first. And then to go back to the point that you made earlier, Sugi, about this use of the present tense and the past tense, I think the emotional impact on the reader is that in the present tense, as I tell these scenes, or as we feel them, it really allows us to get deeply in that moment. For example, I won't go into what it was like to meet Muhammad, but at that kind of moment, we can be in the present tense, and it can give us exactly a strong feeling of what it was like in Morocco then, or in so many of the moments. It really roots us in that experience, and in either the joys of what I'm feeling when I'm in places like San Agustinillo on the beach of Oaxaca, and where I've watched this young boy and he's boogie boarding, and I'm able to kind of imitate him and be in that present and convey it in the present using that present tense. And then at other times, as you're saying, one of the things that I'm trying to figure out in this experience that I had was, how do I integrate that past with my present? How do I take those 15 years, and not just in the way that our marriage ended so suddenly, feeling definitely like a limb that was cut off, not have it be something that is just hidden or put away? And how can that past then be something that can be incorporated into the present? So one of the ways is by allowing yourself to live in the present, as I was saying before, taking in the beauty of the mountains of Oaxaca, taking in all those things that Monica's cousin was teaching me, living in the present there, so that you feel you can feel the happiness of the moment, but also so that then the past doesn't become something that feels overwhelming anymore, something that you cannot control emotionally, or something that overrides your capacity to enjoy life in the present. And that's part of the effort, to take the past and find a place for it to be incorporated in the present. And by the end of the memoir, I mean, I don't, there's a lot I certainly don't want to go in yet, because I think it's important for all the readers who are listening in today to discover. But one of the things, when I'm in Rome for a month after I've gone to Morocco, back to see Luciana, the person who Luciana was with, is I'm in Rome, and what I begin to see are the layers of history there in a way that's so visible only in a place like Rome. You see the pre-Roman kind of buildings that are below the ground. You see the Roman ruins. You see over the Roman ruins the kind of fountains that the Romans had built. And then the Visigoths, when they came, they cut off all the water as they sacked Rome. And so the fountains went dry. And then new fountains are built on top, like the famous Trevi fountain, in which they take those things the Visigoths had kind of ended and rebuild them and turn them into these gorgeous things, so that nothing is lost in Rome. All the layers are present in Rome. And that's what I wanted to find a way, again, nothing that could be understood in advance, something that could only have been discovered through travel and the experiences of travel and seeing things, but discovering that those layers of the past that each of us has, our wounds, our battle scars, those are the things that, rather than burying them, can be parts of yourself that you accept as the complicated layers of your own life.
That paragraph that you read, is so interesting to me because it opens the door in both directions, right? Both into her point of view and yours. And I didn't expect to see that, she, and that's the interiority, like it's very generous and also risky. And it, the memoir then, it invites you, holds you accountable to the notion that, as you said earlier, like there are two sides. You imagine also her on the road. And in both sections, these are viewpoints that are, and this is, I think, one of the pleasures of reading it, viewpoints keenly attuned to different kinds of beauty and sensory experience. It's a book that's very full of sensory detail. And again, like very embodied, like very in the moment. And some of these things, I was reading them and I was sort of like, does Josh remember that? How does he remember that? Right? Did he have to go back and check that? And I was just thinking about, like the kind of investigation. You are also a fiction writer, a very accomplished fiction writer who does research sometimes for your fiction, has incorporated your experiences and research into your storytelling. And I wonder, like, do you feel like you did research for this? And what does that mean in this context?
Well, going first to the part that you were talking about with imagining myself in Luciana's point of view, I think one thing that's really important to understand is I never imagined something that she hadn't really in many ways told me. For example, that first passage where I'm describing what happened on the beach, and soon after that I described what it was like, or in another passage, with her going down on the beach and Muhammad asking her about her wedding ring and herself feeling that she felt disconnected from me back in New York City. I didn't just make these things up as a fiction writer might. These were things that she directly told me. So even when I was, going through the psychic imagination of what it was like in some of these instances, but in almost all cases, except for, say, that walk in Central Park, I really was basing it on things that she was telling me. And to that extent, I think one of the things that's really important is that, as you were saying before, whether the book is brave or not, or we have a responsibility as much as we can within our own subjectivity, because of course, unfortunately, we can't be completely objective, but to try and remain faithful to the truth of what we know, the experience that we've lived, and the experience or feelings or motivation that I felt, say, Luciana had or that I had. So to that extent, the truth of it, the need to find the truth. And as far as the detail, I think partly because I did choose this kind of different way of writing a memoir where I had only lived 1 year of the experiences when I started writing the memoir. So I had lived, say, about 9 months. There were many parts of the memoir I had not lived yet when I began writing the book. And so part of that feeling of kind of where you say how does Josh remember those things? It's because I was allowing myself to be very close to the events as they had been lived. And one of the things that, memoirists tend to avoid that. They tend to avoid it for some reasons, some of which are usually pretty good. One is that they kind of want to get beyond necessarily the emotional fog of a moment, and to get to the essence, perhaps, or to understand enough the significance of a moment before they write about it. And so frequently they write far in the future, and then they look back with quite a number of years and the wisdom they've accrued. And on the one hand, that does allow you to have that kind of wisdom. And on the other hand, it feels so false to me frequently, precisely because it's a knowingness that you don't have in the moments that you live them, where you really are far more blind in those moments. And you lose precisely some of those details that you're talking about that give that feeling of veracity that you were talking about, Sugi, as you're reading it, and that intensity. You lose some of that as well. So I didn't want to lose that. And yet at the same time, I was trying to hold myself to the understanding, look, this needs to have significance, not just to me as I'm experiencing things emotionally, but to the reader, who has to feel that there is that greater meaning. And over the course of the time of writing the book, I was able to then have the distance to be able to look back, and then the multiple years that came after the initial draft of writing. Should we look at some questions
Yeah,
from
I
the
was just going to
audience?
say, I
Yeah.
could ask you tons more questions, but we have some questions from our audience. So let's move to a couple of those, which are, so our first question from Carolyn. I imagine that either legally or as a matter of courtesy, your former wife would have read the manuscript of your memoir before it was published. If so, was that difficult or healing?
Yeah, I didn't share the manuscript with her initially. And the feeling that I had was that, what you owe, I think, very greatly is, again, your effort to be as fair as possible, your effort to not to be someone who's writing something that is like a vendetta or in any way that kind of book. And everyone who's been reading the book tells me it's the complete opposite, with really this effort to get, say, frequently into her point of view. But I felt that this is an experience that the thing about memoir is it's based, it's what you've lived, what you remember, what you understand. There is always that subjectivity. I'm sure if Luciana were to write her own version of this, it would be perhaps different in some significant ways. It would be her own understanding of things. But insofar as it's the life that I've lived and the deep impact that it's had on me, then that's a story that I feel that it's something I have the license to tell, precisely just for me. And without going. And I think most people who write memoir, they actually don't go to everyone who they're writing, who's involved in their life, and say, memoirists really don't do that. I think the public might think that that's the case, but it's really not what we tend to do. Yeah.
So we also have a question from Colin. Now that you have written this book and it's out there, it's been out there in the world 1 week, don't forget to get your copy. Are people flooding you with stories of their or their partner's affairs? And if so, do these stories surprise you or feel very familiar?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and it's something. This is the first memoir I've published. I'm in the process of finishing a second memoir now, and it really is different from fiction when you read it. I've done a number of readings this last week, but I did a kind of pre-publication reading when I was writer in residence at the Hemingway House out in Ketchum, Idaho, this summer. That was the first time I read the work, and I really didn't know what to expect. I mean, anyone who's a writer knows you kind of go out there with this thing that is so important to you, and you don't know how are people going to respond. And what I found so powerful, as Colin in this question is suggesting, is that after the reading, people started coming up to me as they were buying the book, as they were talking to me, and I was signing the book. And so many of these people were telling me, and primarily women actually, but some men too, they were telling me about the affairs that they had lived through, where someone had left them. And not just affairs, I think also very significantly, just people who had gone through, say, the difficulty and pain of a divorce or a separation or some other form of deep struggle. This is a book about the struggles in many ways. It's about what happened to me. But I think one of the things I'm trying to ultimately get at in this book is that we all struggle. We all, of course, face these very deep difficulties, and we have to find perhaps some way to overcome them if we're not going to be overwhelmed by them. And towards the later passages of the book, at one point I was hiking in the high Atlas Mountains of Morocco. And as I'm thinking again about, this is following the footsteps of Luciana, where she had gone into the mountains of Morocco, she had gone to Marrakesh, she had gone on down through the city of Taroudan and on to Mirleft on the Atlantic coast. And so I'm up in the mountains, and I think one of the things, of course, we always have to be aware of when we're traveling is what might seem picturesque or relate to our own personal goal or struggle. There's the reality for the people living there, which can be very difficult. And so there were these women who were doing back-breaking labor in the mountains there, in the high Atlas Mountains, trying to grow vegetables, trying to cut grass, trying to do this labor. And I could see their own struggles that they were going through. And it was a far more significant struggle, really, than mine. Mine was an emotional one. Theirs was literally for subsistence. So I was seeing that and being able to think about my own struggle. So getting back to the question that Colin asked, what I find is that a number of people are coming up to me because this book gives some license for them to think about their own struggles and to share it. And it begins to feel like a tremendously wonderful gift to be given, almost like to be the repository of some of this past. There's someone, I won't mention who she is, but it's someone who, I'll just say someone who had been a secretary at the University of Iowa, where, and I received some communication just the other day from this person telling me about how 30 years ago she had her husband had an affair, and the difficulty for her, and how much reading what I had on the page resonated with her in terms of her own experience, her own effort to kind of say, make herself, look better, feel stronger about herself, those kinds of things. So that's what I'm finding very powerful as I'm beginning to read this, that level of connection with the readers who are sharing with me.
I wonder if we have time for just one more under the wire. So Colin had a double-barreled question. So the second part of it, did you ever let yourself, a storyteller, drift beyond the literal truth to get to a different kind of truth, which you've addressed a little bit, but beyond that, does being truthful feel like an essential response to something that began with a lie?
I love that question because I have never thought of it that way, as in response to a lie. But I do think that again, that need to seek the truth, and it goes so much deeper than the kind of the truth of whatever how things happen between myself and Luciana. It's the kind of inner truth that you go into as you write a memoir, the inner excavation of your own motivations, your own frailties, and ultimately your own resiliency and strength, and your willingness to write about all those things, your own flaws, but also to allow yourself to also be proud of the ways in which you've been resilient. That truth, which you can put on the page, allows you to then, yes, counter the lie, not because you're literally countering the lie, but because you're allowing yourself to survive the after effects of a lie, or the after effects of that kind of being cut off because of that. I want to thank you all so much for coming out tonight, and especially to Sugi, who's a writer I admire so much, her book Brotherless Night. And thank you all for being with us today at Magers and Quinn, and hope to meet you on the page.
Thank you so much, everyone. Don't forget to pick up Josh's incredible book, Wonder Travels. It's really good.
And from those of us here at Majors and Quinn, we just want to thank you again for joining us. Everyone have a fantastic rest of your night. And thank you to Josh and Sugi as well for joining us here. Everybody take care. Thank you very much.